Next, Dr. Maoyen, the CEO of Cold Spring Harbor Asia, who used to work closely with Dr. Watson to tell us about China's life science after DNA double helix.
Okay, first of all, let me congratulate Sunny and the Champion Lab for the third anniversary of the establishment of the laboratory. This is a really great event, and as far as I know, the first one in celebrating the 70th anniversary of a double helix of the world. There was something I also want to say that from the title, that is the life science of China after double helix. I realize that this is too broad. I'm not a person to talk about life science of China. So I want to starting the sharing with a letter from Jim Watson sent to me in 2010 during the 1950s, particularly in 1951. Jim Watson and Crick was pursuing the double helix on the campus of Cambridge, the lovely Cambridge University, of which Shankar shared with us a moment ago. But there is also a Chinese scientist and a story, the seed of international collaboration between Watson and the Chinese scientists. So here is the famous photo of the famous duo of science walking on Cambridge. And there is also a scientist, Tianxin Cao, who was the deputy director of Chinese Academy of Science Institute of Biochemistry in Shanghai. So in fact, the letter sent to me by Jim, he recounts the memory of interaction with Tianxin in Cambridge in 1951. Okay, and on multiple occasions, Jim told me that Tianxin was such a nice fellow. He talks gently. He must came from a good family background. So that's what Jim said. And this was in the 50s. So in 1953, okay, so Jim and Crick, they published the seminal paper of double helix. And Tianxin came back to China, to Shanghai, to start the Institute of Biochemistry. Okay, so that was the first seed of double helix, or Jim Watson and the Chinese scientist established in 1950. And so when they came back, for geopolitical reason, China was disconnected with the Western world for 30 years. But during that 30 years, one of the major scientific achievements was the biosynthesis of bovine insulin. I believe Tianxin was also involved. So, but for that 30 years, unfortunately, China was disconnected with the rest of the world and also missed the revolution of molecular biology, of which the core was, from biology. Biology went through a paradigm shift from a just biology science to information science, as we understand now. So in 1981, okay, China started to open its door to the outside world. And back then, the director of the Institute of Biochemistry of Shanghai, Chinese Academy of Science, Wang Yinlei, he sent an invitation to Jim, inviting Jim Watson to visit China for the first time. Jim responded by cable. I think most of the folks here don't understand that. Now with a cell phone, with internet, with email, back then there was just cable, okay? It was using Morse code. So Jim replied with cable, say that he happily accepted the invitation, and he brought with Les Watson and two of Jim's sons together to China for the first time. And that was in Beijing in 1981. Jim reconnected with his Cambridge friend, Tianxin Cao, or Cao Tianxin, in Shanghai, right here. This was Jim, in a different fashion with a mustache. And they were in Beijing, but the highlight of that entire trip was in Shanghai. And the host was Wang Yinlei on the campus of Institute of Biochemistry of Shanghai. Okay, but Wang Yinlei and Tian Xintao, they were all the students of, or associated with Joseph Niederhan. Joseph Niederhan was a legendary figure promoting Chinese science and technology to the world. Wang Yinlei and Cao Tianxin, they were biochemists. They were not molecular biologists. All right, but again, Jim, gave a talk in Shanghai about molecular biology. And I think the important thing for this very first trip is that the molecular biology group finally connected with China. And Jim noticed the problem of Chinese lacking behind of molecular biology. So he wrote a letter to the ambassador to China back then, Arthur Hummel. And in the letter, Jim expressed clearly that he wants to help China personally by bringing Chinese scientists to be trained in the United States. So that's Arthur Hummel. One of the results of Jim's first trip, somehow Jim established lots of connections with the Chinese scientific leaders. One of the leaders, as you know, that Tan Jiazhen, C.C. Tan, okay? So from the letters, the correspondence between Jim and the Chinese scientists, now we can deduce that Jim sent a lot of information to Chinese institutions and university. So in this letter, Tan Jiazhen, he personally acknowledged that he received these materials, journals, books, from Cold Spring Harbor Lab, personally from Jim Watson. And he thanked Jim Watson. And see, this was Tan Jiazhen in the 70s and 80s. Okay. He was, by the way, for those young folks here, if you don't know him, Tan Jiazhen was a graduate student of Maoyen. And he came back into China, I think right before the Second World War, which is Sino-Japanese War. And he established the first Department of Genetics of Fudan University. So another letter sent by Li Zaiping, who passed away years ago, unfortunately. Then, because Li Zaiping was the first visiting scholar sent by the Chinese Academy of Sciences to Cold Spring Harbor Lab. I think he was trained with Watson, because Jim told me multiple times he called Li Zaiping as TP Li. Okay, so they communicated very well afterwards. So Li Zaiping, that was him, back in the 80s when he first sent to China. So as far as I know, TP Li was probably one of the first Chinese scientists to be trained in Cold Spring Harbor Lab. After 1949, to catch up the molecular biology revolution. And later, T.P. Li became the member of the Chinese Academy of Engineering and specialized in genetic engineering. So there were also a lot of, after his first trip, lots of communication between Chinese scientists and Jim Watson. So here is another letter from Cai Runsen, thanked Jim for sending plasmid from the United States to China, okay? So nowadays, I think this is forbidden by the international mail. So, Jim sent 6 strains of bacterial and also 2 plasmids to Cai Runsen, right? As you can see, there are lots of personal interaction between Jim Watson and the Chinese scientific communities. And Liu Si from Beijing recommending a student to be sent to Cold Spring Harbor Lab for training. That's Jim's response. By the way, the interesting thing is that here, this letter sent by Cai Runsen to Jim Watson was copied to Richard Roberts, okay, who also worked in Cold Spring Harbor Lab for restriction enzyme during that time. So very interesting, historical, correspondence here. So in 2006, when Jim made a second trip to China, they met again, T.P. Li, okay, the Watsons. And T.P. Li later had a famous student, which is, Luo Liqun, a professor of Stanford University, neurobiologist. Because science is a business of people, okay, training people, and you train students, and so that science can grow. And in 2006, Jim met with Tanjiazhen for the last time, before he passed away a few years later. Finally, again, well, congratulate to Changping Lab. Thank you.